Good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another Saving Elephants live stream. We are at war, or so they tell me, with the nation of Iran. And this has led to all kinds of interesting questions, I think. What are we doing there? Why did it start? Is this a war? Did Congress declare war? If they didn't, then how do we justifiably call it a war? What is the end game? And maybe over a longer term, not just with the Trump administration, but what exactly are the ideal and necessary limitations of presidential wartime powers? I have a couple of incredible guests joining us, possibly a third, but two wonderful guests beginning with us tonight. First of all is my good friend, JB Shreve, in the same time zone that I am. It's always good to have somebody else here in the central time zone.
Good to be here,
JB.
Josh.
Yes, and you, of course, are the host of the aptly named The End of History.
There we go. We're there.
JB Shreve. Yes. And also bringing to stage, of course, Eric Cohn, America's Future, CEO of America's Future. It doesn't look like your name's completely scrunched in on the, at least on the vertical mode, but I guess less than a year into that role, if I'm not mistaken.
It'll be a year at the end of May.
Okay, I first met you when you were at Acton, so this is your second go at the career. You are, by the way, I have not forgotten, this is your 10th appearance on a live stream. Unlike Jonah's, you don't get the coveted golden jacket that Jonah hands out, for his remnant guests. We're just a poor, impoverished podcast here, but you get me your contact information, I'll get you a slightly used Saving Elephants coffee mug. Which is
I'll take whatever I can get.
Yes.
Don't turn down freebies. So
happy. So congratulations on your 10th time, gentlemen.
Thank
it's
you.
So good to have both of you back for a spirited and wonderful conversation over a very important issue. I will remind the audience watching, you are more than welcome to interact. You can post questions. I will be happy to submit them, providing they are appropriate and apropos to the conversation. But I want to start here. I have my own theories. But I don't know. I'm kind of confused about this entire venture we seem to be having in the Middle East, as is, so far as I can tell, almost everyone, or at least no one has a great deal of grasp of knowing exactly what we're doing. So I guess I want to begin there. What is the Trump administration's plans, intentions, goals? What are we doing in Iran?
Eric?
I was waiting for somebody to pass the buck there. Look, it's a good question. We have a case here where it's not that the Trump administration has failed to offer a reason for it. It's that I think they have offered every possible reason at every turn of the corner. I think this is in keeping with the way that the Trump administration has approached a lot of things, which is very much a personalist understanding of the way that Donald Trump himself operates. Donald Trump has always been a very nearest weapon to hand arguer, so he's more than happy to pick up whatever the easiest argument is and use that. I think you've found a number of people in his administration who, given different questions, have given different answers to those questions. I think how we ended up here was, and this is a very Trumpian kind of way of ending up here. It's a combination of a couple of factors, and some of it having to do with bluster. I think after deciding to do what we did in Venezuela and seeing how it went and looking at it and thinking, well, by gosh, this was really easy. Okay. You have these protests, and there have been protests in Iran going on for quite a while now. They will bubble up. The regime tolerates them to a certain extent, and usually they die back down. As I can't remember who it was who I had heard in an interview express this, but regimes like this fall when they are either unwilling or incapable of using the kind of horrific violence that is necessary to stop those types of uprisings. Right. Iran is neither incapable nor unwilling of using that type of violence, and I think most of those protesters know it. The Iranian approach had largely seemed to be to let these people blow off some kind of steam. If it starts getting out of hand, then they will put it down, and they will put it down violently. Now, Donald Trump tweets something to the effect of, for those people who are out there, help is on the way. Well, the problem seemed to be that we did not have, as is often the case when the president just starts posting on the internet that we're going to do X. When it comes to the military, it necessitates some pre-positioning and some pre-planning and getting assets in the area if we're going to lend that kind of support. We were not prepared for that. I think they viewed this as kind of a, well, we got to do something because we don't want it to just be left as an empty threat. So we are now engaged in some kind of an mostly air conflict with Iran in conjunction with Israel. It has taken out the Ayatollah. It has mostly taken out the second Ayatollah that they've appointed to replace him. Where this goes from here is really anybody's guess at this point. I am unsurprised that we have gotten the announcement from President Trump that we're going to start kind of dialing things down that we are doing there. I was reminded.
I'm still waiting for him to say mission accomplished.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that in just a moment here, and then I'll throw it back to JB for whatever he wants to, however he wants to take a bite at this apple. I was reminded of the prescient reason why he has said as much as he has said about we're winding this down as I was driving back from an event I was at earlier this evening, which was passing a gas station here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where gas was $4.19 a gallon. I think that's the primary reason why we're seeing these things wind down. It was also the reason why I think the major failure here in this operation was to not do what the Bush administration did prior to our engagement in Iraq. Now, set aside whatever your feelings are about the way the Iraq war ended. And I would even say set aside your feelings about the case that was made for why we should intervene in Iraq. We can relitigate that if people really want to. I don't think that that's all that beneficial to us. But what they did do is they did mount a public campaign. They made an argument to the American people about why we should do something. They built public support for it. They built international support for it. They tried to find support anywhere that they possibly could. They put a coalition together, and then they did it. The error in not making a clear and coherent argument to the American people left us in this situation where political polarization had 80% of Republicans, I can't remember what the exact number was in polling data, largely in favor of this. I think the curious thing would have been to see if this continued to drag out, if and when that number would start to fall, but that the public by and large was not bought in on this. Because again, going back to my original point, it's not that much like healthcare reform fights where people said the Republicans didn't have a plan to replace Obamacare with. It was never the problem. They had too many plans and they could not cohere around one of them. So I think the error primarily was in not making a clear argument for what we're doing and why we're doing it and why we're doing it now. And I think there are answers to all of those questions. The problem is that it turned into a grab bag of, well, whatever feels the most convenient in this moment is what we'll go with. And as the result, we can kind of see is everybody's a little confused. Nobody knows what we're doing and nobody knows how it's going to end.
Oh, JB, you're muted. There you go.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, you used the phrase, he hadn't given a clear and coherent communication as to what we're doing. And I would say that's about standard where we're at right now with the Trump administration. It's very seldom clear and coherent from day to day. It sounds cynical, but as far where I'm sitting, I feel like the reason we are at war is because the Trump administration has just written so many checks with their mouth, and it was time for them to go and cash it. And they realized that reality started to catch up with them. I agree the efforts in Venezuela on basically a failed state went so well for them that they thought, well, maybe this is easier than what we thought. And guys like Hegseth, guys like Donald Trump, even Marco Rubio to a degree, they've talked so big for so long that they finally had to start doing something. And I think that's where we're at. And so we are in a place where the American people, and not just the American people, really the global economy is paying the price for a guy who just talks too much and too loud without really putting a lot of thought behind it. That's simple, that's cynical, but that's the reality of what I'm looking at.
I'm maybe a question beyond why did Trump do what he did, why now and all that is, why did the Ayatollah, after all this was going down, and Trump essentially says, look, we're going to hit the regime if they attack their protesters. And then we send an aircraft to the region. Why did they choose that weekend to gather the Legion of Doom all in one room? And and I'm asking that obviously in jest, but I do wonder if it has a sort of a point to it. Eric, I have wondered some of the same things you have suggested. You kind of list the history of the way in which Israel has neutered in a lot of ways the proxies Iran has had across Hezbollah and Hamas. We've already attacked their nuclear facilities. They had a bloody, what are estimates? 30,000 people they've murdered that protested against the regime, thereabouts. And I know those numbers are disputed. Yeah. Could be higher, could be lower, but certainly beyond what we had seen in the past. And that could signal that this regime is probably does signal a lot more afraid than what they have been. So maybe there was something about the joint intelligence between Israeli and United States forces that suggested not so much it's now or never, but this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. And we have credible evidence that these individuals will be gathered in this place. Plus, as you had suggested, Trump, doesn't want to come off like an Obama, telling a Syrian dictator, don't cross this red line, then they do, and he doesn't do anything. So he wants to come in with some sort of gusto. I don't seem to buy the extreme narratives on either side that Iran was just within, moments of getting a nuclear device and they're going to attack us, so we had to attack then, or that somehow our entire government is so beholden to whatever Israel says that we just had no choice in the matter. I suspect it's kind of messing somewhere in between, and possibly in all of the above. But I'm fascinated by this because I recall when we first hit the nuclear facilities, I was listening to the Breaking Point Crystal Ball, wonderfully ironic name. I'm sure she hasn't had anybody make jokes out of that. Crystal Ball, and I can never remember her host. It's Sagar
Enjeti.
Yes, thank you. They basically took that strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, the joint strike between the United States and Israel, to be Donald Trump is George W. Bush and reincarnated. Like, here we are back in forever wars. And I just thought it was so ridiculous. Like, there's no American boots on the ground. Nobody's suggesting this. And so I listened right before a conversation tonight. Granted, it was a completely different crew, but the NatCon crew and their podcast. So it was kind of, I wonder what they think about this. And they had a much more measured view. They were largely supportive. They were a little, I would call it, cautiously optimistic in that, look, they're not for forever wars. They definitely want America first, American interests. But yeah, Iran's a bad guy. And if we can take him out, kind of like we took out Maduro, then why not? Why not do it? But they still have that sort of, we don't really know what comes next. I'm going to let both you gentlemen respond to that, but I'm happy to share we do have joining us John Giokaris. John, good to see you.
Good to see you. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Glad you were able to make it this evening. I was telling Eric, yeah, you had it was a Greek what now?
Greek Independence Day event tonight. The Greek General Consulate is having an event at the Union League Club of Chicago. So
okay,
we're celebrating liberty all over the world, including in Greece, and thought I'd step away for a little bit to join you guys.
That's awesome. I'm glad you can make it. I was telling Eric, I almost wrote you back. I didn't know you were Greek, and then it just like, wait, what? Who else would have Giokaris as a last name?
Yeah, I mean, it could have been worse. Could have been Papalapodopoulos, but
yeah,
Giokaris is good enough.
Yeah. So, and you gentlemen are welcome to respond to that in kind if you want. I'm not sure if you had any thoughts on what.
So I'll jump on it. That first of all, the fact that, even knowing what they knew, that the leadership of Iran decided to all gather together in the same space that made it possible for the United States to strike them as they did, just goes to demonstrate the lengths that people will go to not have to join a Microsoft Teams call. And you know what? I can appreciate it. I kind of find fascinating the Sagar Enjeti and Crystal Ball analysis of this is in no way surprising to me. I just have I have no time for those two. I don't think they have any particular interesting insights in the world whatsoever. And any insights they do seem to have always seem to end up with the answer being the Jews. So I'm not particularly interested in their analysis. The NatCon part of it tracks largely for me with one of the political problems of our modern age, which is that I was actually just listening to somebody talk about this a little earlier today. As much as we are annoyed by the kind of political strivers that we know of from places like, the elite universities, the guys that go to Harvard and Yale, and who are figuring out how they are going to be a United States senator or how they're going to be president of the United States, basically from the age of 12. Look, those people are as obnoxious as all get out. I think we can all admit to that. But what they do leave those institutions with is a coherent ideological view of the world that allows us to have some predictability about what they are going to do if they get into those positions.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that Donald Trump does not possess. And the political problem that people like the NatCons are inevitably going to get into here is going to be, you always have one of two choices. Julius Krein is somebody who most people don't know, but who I have a weird kind of respect for. He launched this journal, American Affairs, not long after Donald Trump was elected president. And the whole thrust of this project was to put some ideological, philosophical meat on the bones of Trumpism. And the problem he ran into, and he acknowledged it more or less like 9 months after he started, was, yeah, this doesn't work. You can do one of two things. You can either create a coherent philosophy and stick to that, which will inevitably necessitate going against something that Trump says or does, or you can just go along with, we trust the man. So it's not at all surprising to me to hear the NatCon people, who are largely a Trumpist political project, essentially saying to some extent they trust the man. Now, I don't think that this is in any way, not in any way, it is largely not comparable to Iraq. It is not comparable to the global war on terrorism, not only from the perspective of we do not have boots on the ground there, and even to the extent that we might have some troops on the ground in that region in near proximity. It is not likely to turn into, I don't think, a nation building project like we saw with Iraq. I think what you're more likely to get there is a different version of neoconservative foreign policy, which is more from like the Gene Kirkpatrick, rubble don't make trouble kind of philosophy. The other thing that you pointed to in Venezuela, then I'll hand it back over. The problem there too is this, and again, this is where I just have to come back to that Donald Trump just does not understand the difference between these different types of regimes in different places around the world. In Venezuela, you had a kleptocratic regime, something that started as an ideological regime under Chavez, and then under Maduro basically just turns into a corrupt kleptocratic state. And you can, in most cases there, find somebody like Delcy Rodriguez who, doesn't want to end up in a prison in Brooklyn like Maduro, and doesn't want to end up, strung up in the town square in Caracas. So she's more than willing to work with the Trump administration in the United States to give them what they want. That's not Iran. Mm-hmm. There isn't some moderate Ayatollah that you're going to find eventually who is going to be like, yes, death to Israel. We're trying to bring about the end times and all of that. But, I'm willing to work with. This is just not a thing that is going to happen. And it is the failure to understand that. Now, I do think there are people around Donald Trump who understand that. I think Marco Rubio is a smart person. I think he understands that. I think there are some people who do. The problem is it gets back to the point I was making about the NatCons earlier, is you can do one of two things. You can either go with a coherent vision of these things and have coherent answers to those questions, or you just kind of have to follow Donald Trump wherever he goes. And the political incentives of the moment still have most people just following Donald Trump wherever he goes.
I guess I'll pipe in there. My concern is, we're not even on week 4 yet. We're coming close to week 4. And how much worse is it going to get? Because as bad as all of this is, doesn't seem to be any real plan as far as the going in part. There sure doesn't seem to be any real plan as far as the coming out part. And with everything that has been ransacked and destroyed over the last year with Doge and everything else, and don't get me wrong, I'm all for smaller government. I'm all for eliminating corruption, eliminating waste. That's my song, but not in the way it's been done. And it seems like we are incredibly vulnerable from just an intelligent infrastructure standpoint. I mean, we've got ICE manning the booths in the airport right now. This doesn't make any sense at all. It's like I'm surprised it's not worse than it is just yet, but that doesn't mean it can't get a lot worse in the days ahead. And I think as more of these crises start to compound, start to cascade, I think we could see things get a whole lot worse because we don't have the smart people in place to make the best decisions, to make the hard decisions. Hard decisions are not rewarded in this administration. Hard decisions are often punished. They're often, especially if they're not sycophantic, if they're not all there to make the dear orange leader look good, they are often positioned in a way it's going to get people in trouble, and they're going to be thrown under the bus. And so I think we're in for some hard times if we don't get out very soon, but I'm not sure that we're going to get out. The biggest difference, I saw the other day, the biggest difference between Vietnam and Iran is Trump had a plan to get out of Vietnam, not so much with Iran. So that's
a good line.
John, I know you're kind of jumping into the conversation. You're more than welcome to respond to that, or we can move on and I'll have you join in later, whichever you prefer.
Sure. No, absolutely. With regards to the Iran war, on the one hand, I think a lot of things are being underestimated in terms of how tactically successful the U.S. military has been in disarming Iran and depleting their munitions, frankly. And I think overall it has weakened the regime and made the Middle East at least a little more stable and a little more safer. But in the grand scheme of things, I think it's also fair to say, if this whole operation isn't going to lead to a regime change, then what's the point? And if the regime is largely left intact, and Trump basically just is looking for an easy off ramp to declare victory and say, well, we kind of just bombed the crap out of them, and now they're no longer a threat, so now we're out of here. I'm not sure. I mean, look, he's got very loyal Republican support. All the polls show that. But much like during his first term, his independent support has gone way south, and Democrats won't give him anything, including even obstructing him on TSA funding, or well, I should say DHS funding, which is affecting TSA more than it's affecting anything else, including ICE. So I mean, on the one hand, I think that what he did in Iran was a pretty bold move and took a lot of balls to do that. But the success and the support of the whole thing is going to largely depend on what the end result ends up being. And right now, frankly, I think it's fair to say he might not even know what that is yet.
Yeah, yes, that's the $1 million question, right? What happens? What? Not only what does victory look like, but I mean, we only have a limited capacity even to declare that. What happens next in Iran? And I have enjoyed, with both the capture of Maduro and the killing of the Ayatollah, I'm sure you guys have all seen this, the juxtapositions of the pictures between protests in the street denouncing how horrible that we would take out the sovereign leader of these countries, next to people who have actually fled these countries rejoicing in the streets. And when I had learned that the Ayatollah was dead, I nearly cried. And it was backed up by looking at social media because of the number of Iranian dissidents who were weeping tears of joy. And so I don't want to take from the Trump, it's no secret I am no fan of Donald Trump or the administration. But that doesn't mean I don't celebrate the death of and the destruction of a murderous, horrible regime. I think it's the broader question of what comes next, at what cost, what are the trade-offs, are these thought through? And this is the problem with realpolitik. I know that Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism, it's kind of ironic because in reading his book, Autobiography of an Idea, I think he has only one line about international relations in that entire book. And yet, neoconservatism is often thought of as nothing but foreign relation. And he essentially says, look, there's no such thing as like a conservative or progressive idea of foreign relations, because everything is so contextual that you can't form like these completely cohesive ideologies around every situation for all times. Now, there may be some ways of saying that's not entirely true, because I think there are ways in which the conservative and progressive look at the world different and might approach things different. Wilsonian progressivism, of course, can be applied to a lot of different situations. But I take his point that it is necessarily a game of statescraft. It's necessarily a game of prudence and slow, methodical thinking and deliberation. None of these words, in my view, in any way describe Donald Trump, maybe some members of his administration. I mean, we mentioned Marco Rubio, but I think now that the weather's warming up, the poor guy's going to be super busy mowing the lawn at the White House. I mean, given all the other things he's doing, I don't know if he's going to have much time.
Hey, he got rid of his job as the national archivist. He's got some free time now.
Yeah, it'll free him up a little bit. But I mean, that guy's busy. I don't know if he's got enough time to focus on it. So I guess,
Josh, can I real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I pick on one thing John said real quick, which is the absolutely right. And I had brought this up, John, before you came on, that, the political polarization of our time meant that, even though Donald Trump I think really first distinguished himself in the 2016 Republican primary field by his willingness to reject George W. Bush and his willingness to reject the Iraq War and to say that it was a mistake. I think it's definitely true. And we saw, again, Republican support be something around 93% for these actions. The thing that I think is interesting that is really not cashed out yet and was different about the point in time that we're at right now is all the other times that you could point to that were similar to this, either in the first administration or Republican sentiment about Donald Trump in the 4 years that Joe Biden was in office, all held the potentiality of Donald Trump being there for an undetermined amount of time, right? He will be exiting the White House in 2029. And it is pretty much a truism that at some point, party support starts to flag, especially in a second administration. Now, one of the weird things of this is that we can't quite compute is we have, for the second time in American history, a president serving a non-consecutive second term. I have no idea what impact that's going to have on it, but I do think you are starting to see in some things in Congress. I wonder when we get to the point where Republicans are kind of looking at things, are not nearly as impressed. And I wonder if that support does start to fall away when you don't have the looming specter of, well, he is going to run for a second term. Well, he, even after losing in 2020, is going to run for a second term in 2024. The Steve Bannonist nonsense aside about him running for a third term, which is nothing that I believe, I wonder when you're going to get to the point where these things are actually going to start dragging Republican support down. And what is it going to look like when that does start happening, which I tend to think is inevitable. Maybe I will be proven wrong. The Donald Trump phenomenon in politics has proven me wrong about all kinds of things that I thought I knew. But I wonder what things will look like when we get to the point where that Republican support does not prove as sticky as it has historically been.
Seems like it'll probably be November with the midterms. If everything continues as it is, that's usually where things will take the turn. Which
the second term is almost
think,
never good. And after getting slaughtered in the midterms, it is really bad.
Yeah. And with the economy going the wrong direction, it seems like that's certainly something that could play out. And it gives me pause to just kind of think of J.D. Vance. It's like we just don't hear a lot about him. We don't hear a lot from him ever since this started. I think he's done not that I'm a fan of J.D. Vance, but I think he's done a very good job of kind of walking that middle ground between being pro-Trump and not talking about his support of the war.
Yeah, he got oddly quiet. For the only person who I think, well, I mean, and really, and I kind of bemoan this as a modern political phenomenon, he doesn't tweet as much. And on one hand, I'm happy about that. I wish almost everybody in elected office would not tweet at all. But I find it particularly interesting that this guy who I think is of the project that is trying to put some coherent philosophical and ideological meat on the bones of the phenomenon that Trump latched onto. For him to have invested so much in the no foreign policy misadventurism, the neocons are, the big problem in conservative politics, et cetera, et cetera. He sure did get oddly quiet when we got quickly involved in a war in the Middle East. I do find that fascinating.
And as much as I'm not a fan of J.D. Vance, I can appreciate at least he's got a level of ethic, a level of principle in his beliefs that I think is driving that more than anything else, because he's never been for those wars. He's never been, or he's long been against these type of wars. And,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, the only note that I make to that is this is a guy who once wrote for Commentary magazine. Okay. So these are some newfound beliefs. And I am in a way more cynical about JD Vance than I am about Donald Trump. I think JD Vance is absolutely a creature of convenience. I think his modern beliefs, they may be sincere in some sense that he now believes the BS that I think he has been spewing. I think he came to a lot of them entirely out of political expediency.
I refuse to get in a position where I'm defending JD Vance. So just I'm gonna throw that out there.
Do you guys think the MAGA schism is really pronounced in terms of where they stand on this military intervention in Iran? I mean, I know the loudest voices, and I don't know if they really qualify as quote unquote MAGA, but I know the Tucker Carlsons and the Candace Owenses and Steve Bannons and whatnot haven't been really crazy about this whole excursion. But I mean, at least according to the polls, Trump doesn't seem to have lost that much support with Republicans or even self-identified MAGA Republicans. Do you really think it's a serious manifestation of the schism going on in MAGA, or are most people kind of like you said, Eric, just follow the man wherever he goes?
I think this is not a serious schism in MAGA. I think this could easily, let me put it this way, if this turns out very well, I don't think it is just going to be a blip. If this becomes an absolute catastrophe, a quagmire, then we might be able to see the schism. I think where there's let's call it a schism, is that it's an indication, this is kind of what Eric was saying earlier, and we talk about this all the time. This is not, we know this. MAGA is not as coherent as the nationalist populist always want us to believe it is. And so there is a schism in the sense that we're not all lockstep with what does America first mean? I don't think there's widespread agreement. But I don't think this is currently causing Trump any harm. And yes, there are going to be some of the outliers that'll pill off and denounce him over it. But I think time will tell if this becomes truly Quagmire-esque, if you will, then you might see that. But just as it is, no, I don't think it's a schism at all.
I think it necessitates a clarifying question, which is, how are we defining MAGA? Like, this is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall for me. I don't know how to latch on to a definition of it other than to say it's people who support Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is not a coherent philosophic or ideological creature. I think that has in many ways been to his benefit as a politician to not be a creature of philosophy or ideology in the ways that we've kind of come to expect people who are running for office to be. I mean, to have some flexibility within that, sure, and politicians change their mind and flop on things all of the time. Certainly not to the extent that Donald Trump, for the most part, has done those kinds of things. But if by MAGA you mean just kind of rank and file Republican voters who are the people who have just continued to be Trump supporters from the beginning to up until now, I mean, no, there's just no evidence for that whatsoever. I do think amongst the intellectual class, and I hesitate to use that word in description of somebody like, Tucker Carlson and certainly of Candace Owens, I do think amongst that influencer class is perhaps a better way to describe it. I mean, yes, I think it's undeniable that you are seeing some breaking up of that kind of a coalition. I think it is interesting to watch how the way that this is a reference that John will get and probably not the other two of you, but back in the 2000s, when Richie Daley was the mayor of Chicago. He had wrested control of Chicago public schools away from the state legislature. It had been controlled by the state legislature, and he wanted it controlled by the city of Chicago. And he got that. And for a while afterwards, when he would get asked questions about the poor performance of Chicago public schools, Mayor Daley would have this like out of body experience where he would say, you know, oh yeah, Chicago public schools, somebody should do something about that. And like, that would be you. You're the one who wanted it. I think it's kind of similar the way that you see people like Bannon go after what the Trump administration is doing and talk about it in these depersonalized terms that never mentions Donald Trump himself in any kind of direct way. I mean, really, the only person who's the exception to that is Tucker Carlson. I don't know that we want to go down that rabbit hole, but I think that something is much more nefarious going on with Tucker Carlson than with any of these other people. Even more nefarious than, you know, Epstein confidant Steve Bannon. I think it's interesting the way that they navigate that. And it's like in keeping kind of with a common observation about the Trump administration, the Trump phenomenon, which is Donald Trump can't fail. He can only be failed. So here's clearly an example where it's like it's the perfidious neocons in his administration, or it's some kind of influence that pushed him to do this thing that he probably didn't really want to do. Like, no, he thought that this would be fun and cool to take out the Iranian regime. I do think that there was justification for doing that. I think there was an argument to be made for why we should do it. I even think that there was an argument a little bit more hard to make than we should do it now. But a lot of those people are just not going to have any time for that. And it is kind of fascinating watching them trying to navigate the personalism of this presidency and not offend him, but still try to maintain some sense of coherence of opposition to these kinds of excursions, as he described it.
Regarding, I like your phrase, the influencer class within MAGA. I would say, not looking at polls, but just looking at the people. I live in MAGA country for sure, and looking at the people around, there has been a difference the last couple of weeks. There's not as much boasting about what's happening, and in the past, like with Maduro, with other things that seemed outrageous, there was hooting, there was boasting, there was celebrating, even when it was inappropriate to go that far, because this is what it's all about. It's about put it in your face. And that's what Trump is. And this time they seem to be quieter. I'm not seeing large scale resistance or people turning anti-Trump like anything like that. But I think there is something to be said when they get quiet. I think they're happy to jump on board if it goes well, but it's making people nervous.
Let me turn to, and we can continue to talk about this. I think we'd easily fill up the hour this way, but I did kind of tease out in the description another underlying issue we have here, and you can, I mean, you can predictably know which party is going to come up with the angst about how Congress was not consulted and did not approve this war based on who the president is. Now it's the Democratic's turn. Democratic parties. I appreciate the degree to which the Democratic Party has rediscovered aspects of the Constitution that I thought they'd completely forgotten about for eons. Let's hope it sticks when they have one of their own in the White House. But I do think this is an underlying issue in American politics, and it is one that I will confess I do not know the solution to. Let me set it up this way. We were designed initially to be 13 kind of desperate colonies, formed states, and a mostly agrarian society on the far flungs of the earth that was not supposed to be having this sort of, I mean, I know, Alexander Hamilton aside, who foresaw some things the others didn't. If you just take the Jeffersonian view, we were never supposed to be meddling in world affairs to this degree. It was unthinkable. And I think we have a problem in that in a post-World War II world order, where the United States is the defender, or in a sense of the commercial interests of the global West. We sort of took that duty from the British after World War II and set up all these institutions. I don't know that really has ever squared with our constitutional framework, because it seems like I don't know how you live in this world if you don't empower a president to do things that kind of look to me like they're a little disjointed from what the intent of war powers were with the Constitution. I mean, it's been, what was it, Vietnam, if I'm not, or not even that. When was the last time we even declared war? I know it was World War II, but almost everything.
Korea, I believe.
Maybe it's Korea. Yeah, it has become more and more and more just sort of a joke that we keep engaging militarily without what it would appear the Constitution, and I'm sure the audience is, but for those who aren't aware, according to the Constitution, it's Congress that declares war. It's not the president. Now, the president has always been given, all the way back to our founding, the ability to have certain amount of military interventions, because I think it doesn't tax the imagination too much to know that you can't run a nation state where you have to gather 435 people together to all agree on something in the event of an imminent threat. So I'm not saying that Congress has full authority at any discretion the president has militarily. He obviously has that option. But I'm just kind of putting this to you guys. Are we experiencing a fundamentally irreconcilable problem that we are the global superpower, and yet we have a constitutional order that never envisioned that?
I think it's reconcilable. I think the failure that we have here is in the way that people in some sense are talking about it, in that, well, Donald Trump didn't go to Congress to get a declaration of war. And you're right, we've not had a declaration of war since Korea. We have had many authorizations for the use of military force, which is in effect a stand-in for a declaration of war. It's just a little bit more ambiguous as to what the exact target of it is, which coincides with the phenomenon of non-state actors that we have had to navigate over the last 20 years or so. The failure and the way that you reconcile it is not that Trump didn't go to Congress. It is that Congress has not demanded that the president come to them in order for them to approve what is going on. Congress still has that power. If they could find their balls, if we can put it that way, they could demand, they could hold hearings, they can make arguments in public. However, this is just not the way the Congress functions in this modern world. So I think you can square it, even in the sense of, a post, amongst my libertarian friends, I have had George Washington's farewell address quoted at me more times than I can count. And I love it as much as anyone else. And the problem there is always that you have to, in order to completely accept that, you have to just pretend that the 20th century didn't happen. And unfortunately, for them, the 20th century did. And we ended up in this position where there were two global superpowers, and then we won the Cold War, and there was really only us standing there, hat to JB here at the end of history. So I think this is all reconcilable, even with America's position as one of, if not still the lone global superpower, if Congress would just do its job. The problem is that there's just no incentives right now for Congress to do its job. Nobody in there really seems to be serious about doing their job. And even the ones who, I'll give you just a quick example here. John Cornyn is a legislator. He's an actual legislator. He's somebody who cares about passing legislation. And yet he has to do the absolute stupid monkey dance down in Texas because he's running against a certifiable lunatic who is only interested in being a influencer and getting TV hits and going on podcasts. That's the reality of our elections now. And until the American public starts demanding differently of the members of Congress, or members of Congress just all of a sudden remember that they can have a backbone and that they have more power than the president if they want to, and start acting in that way, then we're going to have what seems to be an irreconcilable problem. It's not irreconcilable. Congress just needs to start doing its job again.
I echo what Eric said, particularly on the superpower points and comments. All I can add to that is keep in mind, Congress does control the power of the purse, and the Secretary of War, I guess it is now, is asking for another $200 billion to fund this effort. That can only come from Congress. And fundamentally, I think unfortunately, it really just comes down to the partisan age that we live in. Obviously, Josh, you alluded to it earlier. When President Obama did what he did in Libya, you heard Democrats making a lot of the same arguments you hear Republicans making now. And with Congress under Republican control, they're just not gonna. They're gonna give Trump a lot of leeway. They'll probably try to pass the funding that he's asking for through a second reconciliation bill. And if you want more aggressive enforcement on Congress's role and ability to declare war, you're probably just going to have to elect a Democratic Congress. That's the only way you're going to get it these days. And Josh, I sincerely apologize. I got to duck out early. I'm going to do a shot of Newzo for you guys to celebrate Greek independence. But thank you so much for having me. Greatly appreciate it.
John, it's always a pleasure. Glad you're able to hop on for a little bit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Fun conversation. Talk to you soon.
I think the other reason that you would want, if you're the Trump administration, to make an argument, to go to Congress, to try to get people on the record is kind of what we were talking about a little bit earlier, which is it makes it a lot harder for those people to abandon you if things start going poorly, if you get them on the record. It is going to be a lot easier for members of Congress if things really do start going poorly in Iran. And I want to emphasize, I kind of hate the phenomenon of our modern partisan political age. Nobody should be rooting for that, even for their own pecuniary political interests. Nobody should be rooting for things to go poorly in what we are doing right now. I do not think that that is good. I do not think that that is healthy. I don't think it's good for the world. I don't think it's good for this country. But if things do start going poorly, because nobody is really on the record in support of this other than Donald Trump himself as the person who initiated it, it's going to be very easy for a lot of those people to go like, I supported this at the outset and, but I just can't continue to support it now. Or even just to say, I was never really on board with this in the first place. You've left that window open for a lot of them to jump out and to escape this, which is the reason that they should want to go form a coalition to make an argument. But this is just accepting or just expecting, to get water from a stone. This is just not in Donald Trump's character and not something that he wants to do.
It is something, and JB, I know you haven't spoken in a while. I want to give you an opportunity to get a word in, but it is something that occurs to me, as I was saying earlier, that international statecraft requires prudence and patience and the potential for sacrifice in it, and particularly war. I mean, war is difficult. It's not easy. It is potentially the hardest thing a nation state has to go through. And even in a lopsided war between, say, the United States and Iran, there are going to be difficult moments. They can exact actual harm, and you do need a coalition of participants who have a long-term vision, because there are going to be days when we're riding high, battles are won, and the nation's mood is high. Usually on the outset of a war, oftentimes you have a surge of national pride, if you will, but that wears out after a while and things start to get difficult. And if it's all built on the flimsiness of, well, we took out Maduro, that was easy, that was fun, that made my poll numbers go up, that got the memes going. This could go sour very quickly in a manner that I think is potentially devastating, not only to Trump's approval, but to just our national mood, if you will. And that's something that it's not entirely avoidable. And in fact, in some cases, it may not be avoidable at all. But one ought to mitigate against those dangers to the greatest degree possible. And the sort of things we're talking about, going before Congress, making the case for the American people, is literally the thing that would be necessary to mitigate against what is likely to be offsets, backsteps in the days ahead. Anyhow, JB, I'll let you. We're getting close to the end of the hour, so I'll let you share with us some closing thoughts. And then, Eric, if we want to turn it back to your closing thoughts, we should probably clear up after that.
Sure. I'm agreeing with most of everything that you guys are saying. I think that it seems like a setup, to be real honest with you, when you look at the whole situation. The nature of building those coalitions, of going to Congress and asking for permission to go to war, or their approval, their authorization, their agreement to go to war, those things are not easy. And that's the way it was designed. It was designed to be difficult. The checks and balances were put in there for it not to be something that's driven by impulse, by only public opinion or polls alone. And that seems to be so far in our past now, because now we are driven, our national leadership is driven by impulse. Our culture is driven by impulse, by petulance, by the newest meme or whatever that's out there. And I think that makes us very weak socially. I think it makes us very weak politically. And yet Donald Trump is perfectly positioned as a person, as a leader for that, because that's who he is. That's what he's all about, and that's what has made him successful in politics since 2016. My concern is now that the momentum of history has sped up to such a degree that it could wipe that out, and a lot of things go with it, because it feels like, and it could be wrong, and I've been wrong before about Donald Trump, like Eric mentioned earlier, but it feels like things are getting out of his hand. Like I'm just, it's like, is this the thing that really is going to topple the Trump movement? And if it is, it topples more than Trump. It has a very damaging effect on the global economy, on the U.S. economy, and on U.S. politics. And I think there will be a lot of fallout if this is the thing that finally brings an end to that.
I'm unaccustomed to being in the place of feeling fairly optimistic about this kind of stuff, but I actually feel in a decently optimistic place about this. I mean, look, I have a lot of issues with the way that this has been conducted, and I think I've expressed those over the course of the last hour. I don't have a particular problem. Like I said, I think that there has been a justification for what the United States is doing right now, basically since 1979. Iran was responsible for a significant share of the deaths that happened in Iraq. And after they got involved, after the United States invaded Iraq in the dawn of the Iraq War in the early 2000s, they have been funding terrorist proxies in all kinds of different places around the world. They are funders of Hamas and Hezbollah. They have been funders of the Houthis that have caused so many problems in the Mediterranean, in around the Strait of Hormuz as well. I think that there's absolutely a justification for what we are doing right now. The question of now and the exact timing of all of this, I think, is a big one. But I think there's the very decent possibility that whatever follows the regime as we had known it has the potential of being, at a minimum, less bad than what had been. The argument of what could be worse than the Iranian revolutionary regime under Khamenei. Again, we could say that I suffer and others suffer from a failure of imagination there to think what it could be. I tend to think that the worst case scenario is that basically nothing changes. But nonetheless, you do have the depletion of a lot of the munitions that Iran had. They have also pissed off a whole lot of people in the area, which is one of the biggest changes that we have seen in the Middle East, which is 20 years ago, if something like this were happening, a lot of the neighboring countries would essentially have been on Iran's side. They are not right now. That is a major change in the dynamics of the Middle East, and I think that is generally a positive change. So I think there's the possibility of this working out well. And, as I think people know from me being on this program previously, and even some of the opinions I've expressed tonight, I am not a huge fan of Donald Trump, but I refuse to root against the interests of the United States of America. And I think the end of the regime as we knew it in Iran is a good thing, is the potential to be a very good thing, depending on what follows. The problem is that I just do not know what the administration's commitment to it is. I do not know what their vision is for what is going to come after this. And this is really the place where you would want Congress to assert itself, where you would want people to say, okay, where are we going? What are we doing? And how is this all going to play out? I think those are all things that are completely plausible and reasonable and that are possible to be figured out. But we do need Congress to get back to doing its job. So to one of the questions I know that Josh, you were suggesting in this, which is, ironically, there's one of these weird twists, right? Like the War Powers Act was intended to limit the power of the presidency. And it turns out that it actually gave a lot more power to the president. Well, Congress can reclaim these things at any time that it wants. It just needs to choose to do so. So I think it is in the, what Americans, I think, should do is, generally be hopeful that things go well, but should demand answers to a lot of these questions, and not from the president. Demand it from the people who represent you in Congress. They're the ones who should be demanding answers from the president. You should be demanding it from them. And we should see where this goes. Again, as we pointed out, it's only been a couple of weeks. I think it would be a really bad case scenario, which is, again, back to the reason why you would want to go out and make an argument before getting involved in this, so that Americans might be able to stomach the fact that it's going to cost me $4.19 to fill up per gallon to fill up my gas tank. I think the American people could stomach that for a while if they understand what we were doing and why. And I think it's the biggest deficit we have right now is a lack of understanding of what we are doing and why we are doing it. I think there are answers to those questions. I would encourage the people in power to start answering them.
Food for thought. Well, gentlemen, I appreciate your insights. It has been a good and enjoyable conversation. I'm always grateful for someone daring to inject some optimism into these usually not very sunny topics and dreary conservative commentators. So there is much reason, I'll riff off of a Yuval event, maybe not optimism, but there is much reason for hope. We have good reasons for hope, and hope is a virtue.
Indeed.
We ought to aspire to hope. So with that, I will sign us off for the evening. Thank everyone for listening, and we will see you guys next time.